Welcome to the Lowy Institute. My name's Andrew Shearer. I'm Director of Studies here at the Institute, and it's a great pleasure to have you here today. China has been a hot topic in Australia for much of the year, I think you'll agree. China looms very large for Australia right now. We've seen controversies in recent months over Chinalco's failed bid to acquire a major stake in Rio Tinto and the arrest of senior executive Stern Hu. We've seen China's somewhat testy response to the government's 2009 Defence White Paper, which highlighted China's military modernisation program and the lack of transparency about China's longer-term strategic intentions. We also saw the visit by exiled Uyghur leader Rabia Kadir and the counterproductive response to it by Chinese officials, which saw her emerge as a celebrity in Australia for a week. Australia's increasingly complicated diplomatic relationship with China is reflected in the Lowy Institute's polling, which shows the emergence of a much more ambivalent public attitude. Something like 95% of Australians think China is or will become the leading power in Asia. Of those people, more than half express some level of discomfort with that proposition. 40% of Australians see the development of China as a world power as a critical threat to Australia's vital interests. And more than 40% consider China is likely to become a military threat to Australia within the next 20 years. We're very privileged to have with us today my friend Dr. Thomas Mahnken, to help us understand whether or not these concerns are well-founded. Dr. Mahnken will speak on the subject of China's strategic culture. Can the past inform the future? Dr. Mahnken comes to us with a highly distinguished resume. He's currently a professor of strategy at the US Naval War College and a visiting fellow at SAIS, the Johns Hopkins University School of Advanced International Studies. He was Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defence for Policy Planning from 2006 to 2009, in which capacity he was the primary drafter of the 2008 US National Defence Strategy and contributing author of the 2006 Quadrennial Defence Review. These are the United States' most important defence planning documents. Dr. Mahnken has authored and edited numerous books, including most recently Technology and the American Way of War since 1945, and US military operations in Iraq, Planning, Combat and Occupation. In 2009, he was honoured with the Secretary of Defence Medal for Outstanding Public Service. Thank you. Tom.
Well, I'd like to thank Andrew for inviting me today. I've been trying to get to Lowy on each of my most recent trips to Australia, and I think he figured out the key to actually getting me to come was to invite me to speak, so I actually had to come. I've got enormous respect for the Lowy Institute's work and for Andrew's contribution to it. From an American perspective, it's one of the institutes, one of the think tanks in Australia that I consistently look to for good analysis, good insight into international affairs. Now today, I'd like to talk about Chinese strategic culture, and I do that with two caveats. The first is that I'm really speaking as a private citizen, I'm speaking for myself, and second, I'm speaking not as a deep expert in China, but certainly as a student of strategic culture who's spent a good chunk of the last several years focusing on strategic culture and focusing on China. Now, the very notion that there's a connection between a society and its strategic culture has a long and distinguished pedigree. In his History of the Peloponnesian War, Thucydides records that the Spartan king Archidamus and the Athenian strategos Pericles each linked the capabilities of their military to the constitution of their state. Writing more than 2,400 years later, Julian Corbett drew a distinction between the German or continental and the British or maritime schools of strategic thought, with the former focusing on war between land powers and the latter on a conflict between a sea power and a land power. Basil Littlehart refined Corbett's argument, noting that Britain had historically followed a distinctive approach to war by avoiding a large continental commitment and using sea power to bring economic pressure to bear against its adversaries. And certainly in contemporary strategic studies, Colin Gray has made a powerful argument about the importance of culture in shaping a nation's strategic preferences. Now, in my view, a nation's strategic culture flows from its geography and resources, its history and experience, and its society and political structure. It represents an approach that a given state has found successful in the past, and although not immutable, it tends to evolve slowly. So it is no coincidence that Britain has historically favored sea power and indirect strategies, or that it has traditionally eschewed the maintenance of a large army. Israel's lack of geographic depth, its small but educated population, and its technological skill have produced a strategic culture that emphasizes strategic preemption, offensive operations, initiative, and increasingly advanced technology. And closer to home, Michael Evans has shown how Australia's liminal geopolitical status, its continental identity, and its formative military experiences have shaped its way of war. Well, what of China? China's rise in general, and the growth of Chinese military power in particular, make the task of understanding China's strategic culture an important one for several reasons. First, an understanding of China's strategic culture, the enduring features of Chinese strategic culture, may give us insight into Chinese decision-making. And certainly from a U.S. perspective, one of the things that we talk a lot about and seek in our relationship with China is greater insight, greater transparency. An understanding of strategic culture may be a way to get greater insight, greater transparency in that relationship. Indeed, it may give us insight into behavior that on the face of it seems anomalous. And since strategic culture and clashes of strategic cultures can lead to misperception, as I'll talk about later, a greater understanding of China's strategic culture could help us avoid misperception. We should also study Chinese strategic culture because the Chinese themselves see it as an important determinant both of their behavior and the behavior of others. In the words of Lieutenant General Li Jijun, the former vice president of the Chinese Academy of Military Sciences, culture is the root and foundation of strategy. Strategic thinking, in the process of its evolutionary history, flows into the mainstream of a country or a nation's culture. Each country or nation's strategic culture cannot but bear the imprint of cultural traditions, which, in a subconscious and complex way, prescribes and defines strategy making. Similarly, the authors of the Chinese handbook, The Science of Military Strategy, argue that, and I quote, strategic thought is always formed on the basis of certain historical and national cultural tradition, and formulation and performance of strategy by strategists are always controlled and driven by certain cultural ideology and historical cultural complex. Most Chinese military leaders believe that ancient Chinese values and warfighting principles remain relevant today. Ancient Chinese philosophical texts, military treatises such as the Art of War and the Seven Military Classics, and literary classics such as Journey to the West and The Water Margin are central to the identity of the People's Liberation Army today. The PLA teaches that its members are heirs to an ancient Chinese legacy and that the Chinese Communist Party's revolutionary struggles are part of that legacy. PLA military handbooks routinely refer to battles fought 4,000 years ago as object lessons, and PLA leaders seek guidance from 2,500-year-old writings for modern operations. Indeed, even today, Chinese officers freely distribute translations of the Chinese military classics to their hosts. During a visit to Washington, D.C. last month, for example, the vice chairman of the People's Liberation Army Central Military Commission gave out hundreds of copies of a volume entitled The Wisdom of Sun Tzu that was both a translation of, but also an appreciation of Sun Tzu's The Art of War. Gave out literally hundreds of copies of this volume to his hosts, including to me. Chinese strategists not only view their own traditions in terms of culture, they also view others in terms of their culture. For example, they tend to contrast an expansionist, bellicose Western way of war with what they see as their own pacifist tradition. So what I would like to do in the time I have is to take a few minutes to define what exactly I mean by the concept of strategic culture. I then want to discuss three tenets of China's national strategic culture. The notion that China is culturally superior, the notion that China's natural position is that of the Middle Kingdom, and the notion that China must be unified internally and free from external meddling. I'll then describe, at not so great a length, three tenets of China's military strategic culture. The notion that it's the goal of strategy to exploit the propensity of things to achieve one's objectives, that war is a scientific process, and that through secrecy and stratagem, it's possible to achieve a decisive victory against a superior adversary. I'll then conclude with a few final thoughts, leaving time for some vigorous questions and discussion. So let's start at the top. What is it that I mean when I talk about strategic culture? The literature examining culture and its application to international relations is rich. The sociologist Clifford Geertz, for example, famously defined culture as a system of inherited conceptions expressed in symbolic forms by means of which men communicate, perpetuate, and develop their knowledge about and attitudes towards life. Definitions of strategic culture similarly vary. I prefer Alistair Ian Johnston's definition of strategic culture as an integrated system of symbols which acts to establish pervasive and long-lasting strategic preferences by formulating concepts of the role and efficacy of military force in interstate political affairs. The key notion is that strategic culture consists of a limited, consistently ranked set of preferences that persist over time. Now, the line between culture and cognitive processes is less distinct than was once thought. Recent research by the American academic Richard Nisbett and others challenges the long-held belief that cognitive processes are universal. To the contrary, Nisbett and his colleagues have shown that considerable social differences that exist among different cultures affect not only their beliefs about specific aspects of the world, but also the nature of their cognitive processes. Nisbett's research shows that, in general, cultural traditions influence systems of thought, and in particular, Asians possess systems of thought that are highly influenced by their holistic cultural tradition. In a series of psychological experiments, Nisbett and his colleagues showed that Asians, more than Westerners, or more than Americans, it was his other group, explain events with reference to their context. Where the Asian subjects tended to look and start from the context and work in, the Western subjects, the Americans, would tend to start with the particulars and work out. Now, I think it's very interesting research. A lot can come of it, but also you can make too much of it. Just because culture is influential, it's not necessarily determinative. As Alexander George wrote 40 years ago, culture influences, but does not ultimately determine decision-making. It is an important, but not the only variable that shapes decision-making behavior. Or, as the authors of the Chinese military text, The Science of Military Strategy, put it, culture is not tantamount to behavior, nor is tradition to realities. However, cultural tradition, no doubt, may influence choices of behavior in realities. Now, one of the challenges with dealing with Chinese strategic culture involves disentangling how Chinese leaders portray themselves from how they act. Most Chinese elites believe that China possesses a uniquely pacifistic strategic culture, that China has never been an expansionist state, and that China has never fought an aggressive war in its history. The stereotypical view of China, adopted by scholars in China as well as the West, is thus that of a state possessing a weak martial tradition and a cultural predisposition to seek nonviolent solutions to problems of state. However, as careful historical research has shown, this self-image has not always influenced practice. As Warren Cohen has correctly observed, in the creation of their empire, the Chinese were no less arrogant, no less ruthless than the Europeans, Japanese, or Americans in the creation of theirs. Rather, successive generations created a narrative that showed that foreign nations have long sought to deny China its sovereignty. At the military strategic level, this narrative argues that the People's Liberation Army saved China from foreign aggression and domestic tyranny and prevents more powerful adversaries from interfering in Chinese affairs. This military narrative stresses that China has only fought wars when forced to do so, and has always fought in a defensive and moral fashion. It also highlights the fact that the PLA has won every war that it has fought, even when it faced more advanced adversaries. Ian Johnston's careful work on the Ming period concluded that there was indeed no such pacifistic bias in the Chinese strategic tradition. Rather, China's leaders operated according to the dictates of realpolitik, albeit often cloaking their actions in Confucian rationalizations. And others have corroborated the view that China possesses a dualistic strategic culture, one that is conflict-averse and defensive-minded, and one that favors military solutions and is offensively minded. The mixture of these two outlooks is a worldview that rationalizes the use of force, even when used in an offensive capacity, as purely a defensive measure. This mixture predisposes Chinese leaders to offensive military operations while rationalizing them as being purely defensive. Now, strategic culture can usefully be considered on three levels: those of the nation, the military, and the military service. At the national level, strategic culture reflects a society's values regarding the use of force. At the military level, strategic culture, or a nation's way of war, is an expression of how a nation's military wants to fight its wars. Although practice does not always have to conform to this desire, success in waging wars that run counter to national ways of war often requires painful adaptation. Finally, strategic culture at the service level represents the organizational culture of the particular service, those values, missions, and technologies that the institution holds dear. Now, for the remainder of the talk, I'd like to speak about China's strategic culture on the level of the nation and the military. I'll leave it for others to get down to the organizational culture of the PLA. But first, let me talk a little bit about China's national strategic culture. And I'd like to discuss three tenets. First, the notion of Chinese cultural superiority. Second, the notion of China's natural position in the world. And third, having to do with the link between internal order and external order. So first is the notion that China is culturally superior. China's sense of its cultural superiority derives from its history and the Chinese cultural narrative. Historically, the Chinese perceived their state as coinciding with the civilized world. Those who lived beyond were categorized as barbarians. The Chinese worldview dismissed the notion that any other polity could stand equal to the Chinese. Confucian ideology served both as the expression of Chinese cultural superiority as well as a vehicle for enlightening the barbarians on China's periphery. And it's notable that the Chinese government has in recent years begun once again using Confucius to promote Chinese values abroad through the establishment of Confucius Institutes. I don't know how many exist in Australia, but there currently are more than 60 such institutes in the United States alone, sponsored by the Chinese government and offering Chinese language instruction and cultural seminars. Chinese culture thus displays what anthropologists call ethnocentrism. Now, ethnocentrism, the idea that one social group stands at the center and all else are peripheral and subordinate, of course, that's not a uniquely Chinese attribute. Many cultures are ethnocentric. However, it is a key feature of Chinese strategic culture. The Chinese believe that they possess special gifts when it comes to the art and practice of statecraft. Similarly, the PLA teaches its officers that long-standing Chinese ethical and military traditions are morally and strategically superior to those of the West, and that Chinese cleverness is more than a match for material strength. Why should we care? Well, to the extent that a sense of cultural superiority affects Chinese perceptions, one would expect the Chinese to overestimate their own capabilities relative to other states. As a result, the Chinese leadership might believe that it possesses a broader array of options than in fact it does. And this could conceivably lead China to use force in a situation in which it is actually at a disadvantage relative to its adversaries. A second tenet has to do with China's natural position, that of the Middle Kingdom. The second tenet is related to China's perceived cultural superiority, as well as its geographic position, and pertains to to Chinese views of the natural order of the international system. Throughout much of its history, China served as the core of a hierarchical international system, with tributary states arrayed around its periphery. This historical experience is a marked contrast to that of the classical European state system, in which states, regardless of their power, enjoyed at least formal equality. Right? Equality was based on your identity as a state and state sovereignty, not on power. Similarly, whereas the European state system was historically characterized by a series of shifting alliances, China has traditionally not concluded alliances with other states. It should be noted, however, that China has engaged in activities generally reserved for very close alliance relationships, such as its alleged supply of nuclear materials and nuclear designs to Pakistan in the early 1980s. So while China has not concluded formal alliances, and has in fact resisted them, its actual behavior is that of a state sharing some of its most intimate capabilities, nuclear materials and nuclear weapons designs, with other states. China traditionally maintained hierarchical relations between the center, China, and its vassals or tributaries on the periphery. To the Chinese, this arrangement represented the natural order of things. In the Chinese view, as long as the tributary states observed the hierarchy, there was little need for war. A hierarchy of power with China at the apex was, in other words, seen as a precondition for stability and order. This Middle Kingdom view of international relations was reinforced by China's geopolitical position as a land power. Traditionally, the Chinese government did not send out parties of explorers to discover new lands or diplomatic missions to establish relations with other states. Admiral Zheng He's 14th century maritime exploration expedition, which has recently been celebrated in China, is actually remarkable for its uniqueness. Rather, it was expected that others would come to the imperial city to seek favor with the emperor and his court. Others were expected to come to China. China did not go out to the world. Again, why should we care? Well, to the extent that a desire to restore China's rightful position motivates Chinese behavior, one would expect four sets of developments. First, we should expect to see the Chinese engage in behavior designed to increase foreign perceptions of China as a regional and perhaps global leader. Robert Ross, for example, in the new issue of International Security, has argued, I think convincingly, that China's naval expansion should be seen as a concrete expression of China's international ambitions and as a focus of nationalism, an internationalization, if you will, of China's nationalism. Second, we should expect the Chinese to be sensitive to events that they perceive as affronts to their dignity. Now, interestingly, Chinese military authors emphasize the preservation of national dignity as being a cause of war, something that, at least to American ears, sounds quite strange. In the words of the authors of The Science of Military Strategy, as for a state, when national dignity is humiliated, its influence and consequences sometimes may be graver than that of material damage. In history, it was not rare that war broke out for protection of national dignity. Third, one would expect the Chinese to be sensitive to activity by powerful states on their periphery. And certainly we have a number of recent incidents that would seem to back that up, including the harassment of USNS Impeccable a number of months ago. And then finally, to the extent that the Chinese leadership and population pin their hopes on a continued rise and a restoration of China's traditional role, they're likely to be disappointed or even spiteful should these expectations not be met. Okay, a third and the final tenet of China's national strategic culture that I'll talk about is the notion that a strong, stable China requires internal unity and freedom from external meddling. This tenet of Chinese strategic culture pertains to threats to what the Chinese perceive as the natural order. In the Chinese view, a strong, stable China is a prerequisite for regional stability. Strength and stability, in turn, require both internal unity and freedom from external interference. Now, the course of Chinese history is marked by an ebb and flow between unity and fragmentation, centralization and devolution. Across the span of time, unifying and protecting the Chinese heartland has formed a consistent goal of Chinese statecraft. Now, in the Chinese view, internal unity produces stability, whereas internal division leads to instability and regime change. The need to maintain internal unity is apparent in the concept of the mandate of heaven, which manifests itself through the acceptance of a ruler by the people. When the populace accepts the government's hold over the mandate of heaven, they accede to its rule and civil unrest is minimized. Conversely, once the people believe that the government lacks mandate, they will rise up and the government will collapse. In Chinese eyes, internal weakness and external meddling are linked. Both the Warring States period between 475 and 211 BC and the century of humiliation that began in the late Qing dynasty are frequently cited by Chinese authors as examples of this linkage. These experiences emphasize both the dangers of internal conflict and suggest that the international arena is violent and predatory. It's led to high levels of concern with maintaining internal stability at whatever the cost, including costs when it comes to human rights. The Chinese Communist Party values stability and unity above all else and views ethnic groups such as the Uyghurs, religious movements such as Tibetan Buddhism, and social movements such as the Falun Gong as threats to its legitimacy. Similarly, PLA doctrine places a high value on ensuring national unity and freedom from external meddling. In the words of the authors of Science of Military Strategy, to protect national sovereignty and territorial integrity, resist aggression and subversion from outside, and safeguard people's labor in peace. Those are the main missions. Again, why should we care? We should care about this because Chinese leaders may overreact to domestic unrest. Indeed, I would argue that they have already done so in a number of cases, be it the Tiananmen Square protest that led to the Tiananmen massacre, or the crackdown on the Falun Gong more recently. We should also care because the Chinese leadership may draw connections between internal and external developments that aren't there, that they will, and as we've already heard, they see in internal unrest external fingerprints that are illusory. But we may still have to face the consequences of that misperception. Now, let me just run through 3 features of Chinese military strategic culture. First is this notion that the goal of strategy is to exploit the propensity of things to achieve one's objectives. This is the concept of shi, S-H-I, the propensity of things. And this is, I'm drawing here on very good work done by the French sinologist François Julien, who makes a compelling argument that the Chinese view of the world is fundamentally different from a Western view of the world that really ultimately derives from that of ancient Greece. Whereas we tend to think in terms of instrumentality, in terms of causality, the Chinese view is much different. And specifically where we tend to think of objectives and work back to figure out how to achieve those objectives, this idea of the propensity of things argues that success involves aligning oneself with the pre-existing propensity of things and sort of riding the wave to success. Why should we care? Again, we should care because to the extent to which Chinese leaders and the Chinese military views causality, views the world, views instrumentality in different ways than we do, we're likely to have misperceptions, and we're likely to come to cross purposes. Second is the notion that war is a scientific process. Both ancient and modern Chinese strategic theorists and practitioners advance the view that war follows scientific principles and should be studied and followed. In particular, Chinese strategic culture stresses the importance of analyzing the adversary as a preconception or precondition for success. Chinese military classics, including Sun Tzu's The Art of War, but not exclusively Sun Tzu's Art of War, emphasize a thoroughly analytical approach to campaigns and battles, one that stresses pre-war calculation, intelligence gathering, planning, and preparation. To quote François Julien, from early on, Chinese thinkers believed that they could detect in warfare's unfolding a purely internal necessity that could be logically foreseen and accordingly perfectly managed. Chinese strategic culture emphasizes minimizing armed engagements. Rather, the ideal is that of winning without fighting. This arises not out of any humanitarian impulse, but rather out of the desire to capture resources intact so that the victor may use them for his own purposes. This, in turn, depends on accurate assessment. If a general assesses the full variety of variables correctly, victory will be determined before engaging in battle and may even make battle superfluous. It's worth noting that what little we know about contemporary Chinese decision-making appears to corroborate the importance of assessment. The Tiananmen papers, for example, portray a Chinese leadership that is hungry for massive amounts of information throughout the crisis. We should care about this because the Chinese may see power balances very differently than we do. We need to understand that perception to avoid accidentally leading to crisis or conflict. Finally, is the notion, the third notion I want to talk about in terms of military strategic culture, is the notion that through secrecy and stratagem, it is possible to achieve a decisive victory against even a superior adversary. The Chinese way of war focuses on the mind of the adversary, with the goal being to have the greatest psychological impact. The ideal operation is one that is timed perfectly to be both quick and decisive, leaving the enemy at a material and psychological disadvantage. Such a strategy depends on an intelligence advantage, which I've already talked about, but one of such a magnitude to be able to catch an adversary off guard. Similarly, the idea of stratagem or deception has a long history in Chinese strategic thought. Chinese strategists, both ancient and modern, believe that through strategic cleverness, they can secure a decisive victory at little or no cost. Conversely, as Curtis Hagen has noted, the concept of fair play is absent from the Chinese classics. Rather, any atrocity which expeditiously achieves one's purposes is acceptable. Now, a central concept is that of the assassin's mace, this fantastic hidden weapon that is unveiled and used at the decisive point and has an overwhelming impact. And this is a notion that one sees, well, throughout Chinese literature, but also throughout Chinese military writings, the idea of some sort of miracle weapon, some silver bullet that will yield victory. Why should we care? Well, we should care because an overweening sense of that surprise and deception can lead to victory holds with it the danger that China's reach will exceed its grasp. That China's leadership will convince itself that it is more powerful than it is, that it can very quickly and decisively gain victory. It's a formula for starting wars. It's not necessarily a formula for winning them. And again, it's the type of thing that we need to be thinking about as we build relations with the Chinese. Now, what I've offered really has been in the spirit of an extended set of hypotheses. I'm not saying, and the title of my talk ends with a question mark, not a period or let alone an exclamation point. But my basic argument is that China's strategic culture, China's history, China's philosophical heritage is an important way of trying to understand China's behavior today and may give us some clues that we can use to understand the way China is operating. And as Andrew has pointed out in his introductory remarks, I think there is a lot of lack of transparency. There is a lot of confusion, certainly in U.S.-Chinese relations. And I wouldn't presume to talk about Australian-Chinese relations. But I think that China's strategic culture is a lens that can offer us some clarity, some transparency.
Thanks, Tom. Terrific.